Hello and welcome to another iceberg video. Now if you've stuck around, you might know that most of my content has been centered around Pokemon at the moment, but you might be surprised to know that I'm a pretty massive fan of Animal Crossing. New Leaf was probably my favorite game on the 3DS, and I've been playing New Horizons pretty often as well. If I could find a way to record on my Switch, I might be able to set up some more Animal Crossing content. But for now, I'll be talking about the worst Animal Crossing New Horizons villagers of every species. Now let's get this out of the way. I quite like most of the villagers, and I'm glad I do. It helps keep my options open as to who I want to have within a save. I think my best villagers video is going to be a lot more personal and perhaps more contentious than this video. For the worst villagers, it's mostly due to appearance. In some cases, it might be due to the aesthetic or concept, but in a couple of cases, it's just because I didn't enjoy having them around in one of my saves, which is something I don't often say. And there are some villagers in this video that I don't mind having around, but I still have to pick someone. And keep in mind that my least favorite species and villagers will be highlighted in red. So with that out of the way, let's start with alligators. The alligators are a run-of-the-mill species in my opinion. Both sides of the spectrum fall out fairly easily for me, and as for the worst one, I've gone for boots. One thing you'll notice with a fair share of returns and new arrivals in New Horizons is that when they smile, they have this sort of curved eye pattern that just almost always seems awkward for me. Boots is one of those cases, and I guess apart from the color scheme, there isn't much that makes up for it. Anteaters. I would say the anteaters are pretty underrated overall. At one point I ranked them even higher than the cats. I mean, who even does that? Anyway, in terms of the worst of its species, she's got a fairly similar story to Boots. Although she was in older games, she was not in New Leaf, at least not initially. The villager I'm talking about here is Snooty. Now first off, having your name be the exact same as your personality is pretty unintriguing. And second of all, the design simply isn't that good. Not a fan of the angry eyebrows, and again, there isn't really anything that makes up for it. Bears. I mean, was it ever going to be anyone else? It has to be Chow. I think Chow might be one of the most infamous villagers in the franchise. His facial expressions are just creepy, especially when he's upset. From his eye design to his toothy, it's not even a grin, it's technically more of a grimace. That might make it even worse actually. Birds. I'm probably not in the majority when it comes to the birds when I say that I quite like most of them. However, there's one that I've had in my very first New Leaf town that might be the only one I wasn't a fan of. Also a pick that I'm surprised I haven't seen from anyone else yet. I've gone for Twiggy. I think the main problem I have with Twiggy is that nothing about her matches up with her peppy personality. You've got the angry eyebrows and the blue cheeks, and that's about it. I could give credit to simplicity when it works, but it doesn't work here. Bulls. This one was a tough decision. I don't care for most of the bull villagers, but in terms of the worst, it was close between two. Even though I did have a somewhat memorable experience with this guy back in New Leaf, by process of elimination, I'm going to say Coach. I like the concept of him being some sort of marathon runner, especially since he's a jock villager, but I don't think the yellow works with his gray stubble. I also think the eye design is a bit messy overall. Not terrible, but if I have to pick someone, it's him. Cats. The largest species in the game, and a lot of people have them as one of the best species. I disagree with that. I think the cats are much more of a mixed bag with some really good ones and some really bad ones. I was close to going for Tabby here because her smile just seems really unsettling. I like the concept of what they were trying to do with her, I just don't think it worked out that well. Now if you want a cat villager that is bad in both concept and execution, it would be Stinky. This is a villager that's supposed to be centered around wrestling, and while I don't mind the mask, I don't like anything else about him. The sickly shade of green does not work with the color scheme of the mask at all. And the facial design doesn't make any sense either, especially around the eyes. Chickens. Another run-of-the-mill species overall, and my least favorite of the bunch is Nox. Nox is meant to be based around a night villager, and I think Sterling pulls off that look a bit better. The Liberty Bell-shaped helmet tends to overshadow this concept. Also, I really don't like his interior. It looks like it's some sort of morgue or funeral, and it just creeps me out. Cows. Only 4 to choose from, and the worst is a pretty easy decision. It's Naomi. Probably the riskiest design of the 4, and it was simply a risk that did not pay off. The sky blue doesn't work well with the red and black eyes, and I'm not a fan of the red lipstick either. It's just a messy design overall. Cubs. I'm a pretty big fan of most of the cubs, but in terms of the worst one, it's close between 2. I'm gonna go for the more obvious choice here. This guy might just be one of the easiest targets in this video. It is Barreled. I think the reason why so many people don't like Barreled is because, in comparison to other cubs, his design is a little more unorthodox. The eye design is strange, and the pink lips are pretty terrible. One thing I noticed is that in New Leaf, there are at least whites in and around his eyes with this sort of semi-polygon outline. I think I prefer that version because the outline makes a bit more sense there. Deer. If you asked me who my least favorite deer villager was back in New Leaf, I probably would have said Eric or Bam, and they're both very solid villagers. Just a shame that the new arrivals didn't click with me as much. I was so close to going for Shino. She's another one of those villagers with the curved eye design when she smiles, which is really disappointing. But I do like that we have a peppy deer villager in this game now, so I guess go for the other one, Chelsea. Chelsea just seems less interesting overall in comparison to Shino, and her design has her own set of issues. The bunny ears don't make much sense, and I'm not sure if I'm sold on the hairstyle either. The deer villagers are one of my favorite species overall, but the new arrivals just don't match up with the rest of them. Dogs. This is another one of those picks that I'm surprised is getting some hype. It might just be a bit personal because I remember having him in my largest New Leaf town, and I didn't really enjoy having him around. That villager is Shep. Shep is based around a sheepdog, so I get where the concept is coming from, just not a fan of how it's executed here. I really don't like how his eyes are constantly covered, except when he acts surprised and one eye pops out for the purpose of, I have no idea. Not a fan of the catchphrase either. Ducks. The ducks are really cute. I like the sort of squat faces and cartoonish beaks overall, but the worst of the bunch, and dare I say it, the only bad duck villager in this game, is Pate. These eyebrows just don't work for me, and neither does the hairstyle. I think Pate is a similar case to Twiggy because maybe apart from the pink cheeks, there really isn't anything about her that matches up with her peppy personality. Eagles. A very solid and very bold species overall. In terms of my least favorite, it was initially between Buzz and Quinn, but there was one villager that soured on me just a little bit more. That being Keaton. Now I don't mind the tropical color scheme, but I think what bothers me the most about him is the eye design. At least with Buzz and Quinn, their eye design just seems cleaner in comparison, I guess. While Buzz may be the most boring, I think Keaton's probably the most annoying if I had to pick someone. Elephants. Now I didn't think I would have said this back in New Leaf, but after having him around in New Horizons, I would probably say my least favorite of the elephants is Big Top. Big Top was just much more forgettable than I expected. A superhero villager that just feels overshadowed by Kit Kat and Agent S. I especially don't like his angry expression here, where his eyes just pop out of his visor. It only works for others because it only happens when they're surprised. Frogs. No species defines the term mixed bag any better than the frogs. There are some great ones, but also some pretty terrible ones. At first it was between Gigi and Jambette, and for very similar reasons. But just like the Eagles, one villager soured on me a slight bit more. I've gone for Croak. The facial design is pretty weird overall. I'm not a fan of his constant frown, but at least that sort of look fits with his personality. That said, I don't get, and especially don't like, the sort of dead eye style he has when he's surprised. Goats. The main problem I have with this species is that there aren't too many highlights around them. Their general design isn't all too great to look at. But for the worst one, I think it has to be Velma. I remember having her in an earlier and smaller New Leaf town, and I wasn't a fan of her back then. Turns out I'm not even alone in that. The glasses, the freckles, and the hairstyle just don't make for a good design here. I will say though, at least it makes sense that she tends to be centered around education. Gorillas. The gorillas might be the most infamous species out of anyone. Most of them have their butts sticking out for absolutely no reason, and their faces seem over-designed for lack of a better term. For me, it was tough deciding between two, but I've gone for Boyd. First off, with his eye design, his angry expression looks a bit more confused than it is angry. Secondly, the orange cheeks look out of place. And third, and perhaps most importantly, that mouth is just massive. Hamsters. The deer and the hamsters were initially introduced in New Leaf, but it's safe to say the deer stand out a lot more. In terms of the worst one, I think a lot of people will be surprised to know that I have not gone for Rodney or Graham with this pick. Look, I don't think Graham's good, but I've had Rodney a couple of times in New Leaf, and I think he's pretty decent. So who could I possibly pick here? Well, I've gone for the newest one, Marlowe. And just like with Boots and Shino, Marlowe's another newer arrival that has this sort of curved eye design when he smiles that's just disgusting to look at. And even if the Mafia concept may be more intriguing compared to the likes of Rodney and Graham, those eyes just overshadow anything else about him. Hippos. Another one of my least favorite species. That wasn't the case initially, but some hippos did eventually fall back on me. Hippo, the French version, seems like a pretty infamous villager. I don't think he's good, but he could have had some decent chemistry in one of my previous islands, since I already had Bertha, and he was in the same New Leaf town as Sylvia. I can sense a sort of antagonistic rich boy aesthetic with this guy, although that shade of green is not pretty to look at. But with all of that being said, I do think Harry is worse. The main issue I have with Harry is the facial hair. In some pictures, it looks like someone scribbled Sharpie on his face. It's really messy, and the shade of yellow near the bottom doesn't mesh well with his teeth for some reason. Horses. There are a lot of horses that stand out to me, and even the worst ones aren't downright awful. It was close between three, but I've gone for Clyde. What bugs me the most about Clyde has to be the eye design. It's just confusing overall. Why on earth do those eyes turn into Pokeballs when he acts surprised? Also, even outside of that, there isn't really anything interesting about him that makes up for it. Kangaroos. A fairly forgettable species, but I think most of them are okay. My least favorite kangaroo villager is Walt. There are a couple of villagers that try to go for a sort of older aesthetic. It makes sense for some cranky villagers, but I think Dobie pulls it off slightly better. Here the sort of grayscale color scheme and the closed eye look isn't really that inviting. The other kangaroos generally seem more approachable. Koalas. What's interesting about this species is that even though it's far from one of my least favorites overall, it is home to my least favorite sisterly villager in Canberra, and my least favorite smug villager in Eugene. His facial design is just so awkward to look at. I especially don't like when his teeth occasionally show when he gets upset. And if you haven't seen the eye design behind those shades, well, just don't. Lions. Most designs are pretty strange, and there isn't much quantity within the species. There were only 5 back in New Leaf, with 2 others returning in New Horizons. And as for the worst one, tough, but I'm going to say Leopold. Some lions have an interesting aesthetic that makes up for their design. I'm guessing Lionel and Elvis's designs are centered around royalty, and Mott carries a sort of college student aesthetic. Leopold, much like Velma, is centered around being a teacher, and that aesthetic doesn't click with me as much, and neither does the green mane. Again, if I had to pick someone, it's probably him. Mice. This might be my least favorite species in the franchise. There are just so many bad ones and not too many good ones to make up for it. So where do I even begin here? You've got Moose with the constant eyebrow raise. If I wanted one of those, I'd rather get one from The Rock or Carlo Ancelotti. You've got Limburg, where the gold and orange clashes with the gray facial hair. Anaconda and Rizzo are pretty annoying to look at, but the absolute worst of the bunch is Greta. And the main reason I've gone for Greta is because her angry expression is absolute nightmare fuel. Her eyes get disproportionately larger, and it's just extremely unsettling. Not a villager I'd want to have anywhere near my island. Monkeys. I don't really have a strong opinion on this species overall. In terms of the worst one, it's a pretty easy decision. It is Elise. You know how snooty villagers often focus on beauty and appearance? Well, let's just say Elise didn't get the memo here. The green fur with the tan skin tone doesn't work together, and the large pink lipstick absolutely doesn't work either. Octopi. I absolutely do not care for any of these four. The design generally doesn't click with me. From the constantly open mouths to having 4 tentacles represent each foot. It's tough to rank, but for now, the worst one is Zucker. Zucker just wound up souring on me. The green freckles are a bit out of place, and the eye design has gone from interesting to inconsistent. In one of my previous islands, I let go of Cephalobot for a villager I had in my very first New Leaf town, and a couple months later, I was on a villager hunt for a lazy villager, and I was kinda livid to see him as the first one. One octopus villager felt like one too many. Ostriches. Alright, finally out of the relegation zone for now with these. The ostriches are a pretty unique species, with a lot of them carrying their own aesthetic. But if there's one villager that could use an out there aesthetic, it would be Sandy. This might just be one of the blandest designs in the whole game. The color scheme is just so basic, and even with the eye design, it makes me feel like she doesn't want to be here. Quite possibly one of the most forgettable villagers in the franchise. Penguins. The penguins are pretty great overall, and as for the worst one, it was close between almost all of the lazy villagers. But here I've gone for Chabwick. To me, Chabwick just seems like a discount version of Puck. The blue feels similar to the helmet Puck wears, and overall, his return doesn't feel as needed as some others. Mostly because he doesn't have too much to offer design-wise, but at least his catchphrase is pretty good. Pigs. And we're back into the drop zone with the last of my least favorite species. There's some really bad pig villagers and not a lot of good ones to make up for it. And you know how some people have their own nemesis or something in this game? The absolute worst villager out of anyone? Well, at least back in New Leaf, that villager was Rasher. The whole trend of the curved eye design really seemed to start with him. It is just creepy and unnatural to look at here. I really don't like the toothy grin concept either. When Xiao and Rasher move into your save back to back, you know it's time to start over. Rabbits. This pick is probably the most contentious out of all of them, but I'm just going to say it. I cannot stand the hype for Coco. Her overall design just seems so empty. All it is just 3 holes carved into her head, and there's next to no expression whatsoever. It's hollow in every sense of the word. That design just isn't remotely passable. Rhinos. This one was fairly tough at first, but after having her in New Horizons, I think I can safely say that Renee is the worst of the bunch. In my current island, at the time of recording, I had her as a starter. I wanted to give her another chance to see if she'd click with me, and it simply didn't work out. The 2 things I dislike the most about her are the eye design and the catchphrase. I think it's just really bland. She never seemed to fit into my long-term plans for the island, and that was proven when she moved out. Sheep. If you asked me back in New Leaf who my least favorite sheep villager would be, I would probably say it's a tough decision. New Horizons, y'all made it a whole lot easier for me. I've gone for Cashmere, and it's not even close. The sickly shade of green is abysmal. The facial design is generally an eyesore, and even down to the catchphrase it's really bad. Might be one of the only times where I could safely say I don't like a single thing about her design. Squirrels. There are a lot of great squirrel villagers. I found it difficult to decide who's the worst one, but someone had to sour on me, and that someone was Sheldon. On the surface he seems okay, but when he gets upset it's much rougher to look at than it used to be. His mouth design is especially ugly there. It's a shame because I think everything else about him is fine. Tigers. This is probably the only species where I can safely say I enjoy each and every single one of them. Not sure exactly why, maybe it's the fact that I had Claudia in my very first New Leaf town. I thought she represented her personality and her species very well. One villager that I think could represent his personality a little better is Leonardo. For a fair share of villagers, I had to be extra nitpicky, if you couldn't already tell. And for Leonardo, I think he could maybe fit better as a lazy villager. The eye design doesn't feel as confident or as fierce as the likes of Tybalt or Rolf. And sure, Rowan may have a similar issue, but I think Leonardo's design overall is just a little less interesting. Wolves. The last species of this video, and one of the toughest to decide in terms of who's the worst one. I've struggled to choose between 3, but for now, I'm going to say Vivian. The main issue I have with Vivian is the color scheme. The tan fur with the grayish snout doesn't really work for me, and even the blue eyeshadow feels a little out of place. The other two just don't bug me as much. I would say overall she's just the least convincing within her species. And that is going to wrap up this video. Let me know of your least favorite villagers in the comments below. And if you guys enjoyed and want to see the best villagers, then feel free to like this video and subscribe to the channel. And I'll talk to you in the next video.